The Autopsy of the Empire and the Awakening of the Insula, A Biochemical Diagnosis of the West and the Delphic Path of Perception, by Evaristo Torregrosa Rodríguez. The contemporary slave offers his bones to the meat grinder of the spectacle in search of a disembodied glory. The free man expands his perception to find ecstasy in the warmth of a shower or the weight of the air on his own flesh. Introduction: The Mirror of the Empire in its Quarter Millennium. In this year, 2026, the United States of America commemorates the 250th anniversary of its Declaration of Independence, a milestone that official rhetoric celebrates as the pinnacle of individual freedom and the success of human development. No nation in the history of humanity has accumulated such economic power, computing capacity, or a scientific, psychological, and medical research apparatus of the magnitude of the North American country. Its institutions dictate the guidelines for global mental health and neuroscience, turning its society into the most monitored and documented epidemiological and sociological laboratory on the planet. However, behind the gigantic showcase of gross domestic product and technological innovation, the molecular analysis of its population reveals an alarming existential and medical paradox. The richest country on Earth is, at the same time, the most pained, addicted, and anesthetized collective organism in history. While its founders designed a conceptual map oriented toward the pursuit of happiness, the biological reality of its citizens demonstrates that the superpower has confused the blind impulse of addiction with the complex art of authentic pleasure. This article analyzes, through the clinical and biochemical data of the United States itself, how pain and variable reward have hijacked the cerebral cortex of the empire, delivering a reality check to the dogmas of rationalist sovereignty and uncovering a cultural virus that is currently spreading as a pandemic across the globe. The X-ray of pain, the anesthesia market as a symptom of civilization. To evaluate the health of a civilization, one should not look at the height of its skyscrapers, but at the contents of its household medicine cabinets. The data accumulated by the federal health agencies of the United States offer irrefutable documentation of a social body in a state of defensive entrenchment. The most tragic manifestation of this phenomenon is the chronic crisis of synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl and oxycodone, which causes tens of thousands of deaths annually and has fractured the demographics of entire communities. Fentanyl, a drug originally designed to mitigate extreme pain in terminal patients, has become the substance of mass use for a population that desperately needs to shut down its somatic reality. This massive dependence on exogenous chemistry to block pain receptors reveals a multi-organ failure in the design of their lifestyle. The United States has built a hyper-connected, competitive environment saturated with abstract information that exhausts the prefrontal cortex and subjects the organism to continuous cellular stress. Pain is not an anomaly in the American system. It is the logical thermodynamic response of a biological animal that has been stripped of its natural rhythms and whose interoceptive alert system, governed by the insula, roars in the face of wear and tear and sensory malnutrition. 2. The pandemic of stupidity and the meat grinder of the spectacle. As a consequence of the immense geopolitical and media influence of the superpower, this degrading neurobiological model expands across the planet as the worst pandemic in humanity. The virus of the American dream inoculates millions of individuals from all latitudes with a sickly obsession for financial opulence, mass fame, and hierarchical power, systematically subordinating basal health and well-being to the acquisition of abstract prestige. This dynamic of alienation came into absolute focus in the recent mixed martial arts bout held under the direct auspices of the North American Executive in Washington, where the Spanish fighter Ilia Topuria suffered a violent medical defeat against Justin Gaethje, resulting in multiple orbital fractures and his immediate hospital admission. The conventional narrative indoctrinated that the hunger and severe deprivations suffered during childhood would endow the individual with insurmountable combat capacity and endurance. However, the harsh reality of the octagon demonstrated that the purely reactive impulse of scarcity is easily assimilated and destroyed when introduced into the industrial gear of mass entertainment. This event serves as the perfect biological metaphor for our era, a pandemic of collective stupidity that desecrates the body and uses the physical integrity of individuals as disposable fuel to feed the disembodied myths of success and domination. 3. The blindness of addiction versus the high engineering of proportional pleasure. God gave so much joy to the world that he put pleasure and pain to identify his holy will. Against the traditional dogmas that have attempted to spiritualize human existence by distancing it from matter, it must be rigorously stated that God above all is not love. God is pleasure, because love sometimes leads to pain, and pleasure is always pleasure, period. The fundamental error of Western psychological organization has been equating the variable reward circuit and dopaminergic addiction with the conquest of authentic pleasure. Neuroscience has shown that addiction is a blind biological mechanism, governed by massive dopamine spikes in the nucleus accumbens, that drive the subject to compulsively repeat the same behavior 1,000 times over. This irrational force is the same one that historically dragged Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar into their obsession with power, and the one that pushed magnates like John D. Rockefeller to the infinite accumulation of money. Addiction and pain possess an alarming biological advantage. They come on their own, require no intellectual effort, and are triggered by the mere exploitation of primary survival instincts. Conversely, authentic pleasure, as defined in the theory of the proportion between units of pleasure, pro-uniplacer, is a work of high biological engineering that demands measure, rhythm, and strict respect for the laws of matter to avoid hedonic adaptation. Real pleasure costs because it requires governing one's own organism with interoceptive finesse, while pain and addictive impulses invade the unprotected body, dragging it into a chronic loop of cellular degradation. IV, the homeostatic alternative, and the updating of the Delphic triad. Faced with this civilizational collapse, the methodological formulation presented in the text Pro-Uniplacer demonstrates that optimal well-being is a state of low entropy and external independence that is perfectly achievable. The most radical phenomenological experiment of our time is not located in the financial centers of New York, but in the urban periphery of Elche, specifically in the humble surroundings of the Palmarales. There, the design of an existence free from cognitive debts, devoid of combustion vehicles, technological consumerism, or parasitic travel, demonstrates that homeostatic stabilization at a constant body temperature does not require material opulence. By clearing the receptors of market saturation, stimuli of minimal energy intensity, such as the thermal gradient of a hot shower or the contemplation of a clean natural environment, trigger states of joy inaccessible to the medicalized citizen of the superpower. This system of carnal sovereignty recovers with scientific precision the three fundamental directives that classical antiquity inscribed on the pediment of the Temple of Delphi. First, know thyself, interpreted as the biological obligation to understand the chemical and mechanical laws that govern one's own nervous system to self-manage internal states. Second, everything in proportion, which acts as the law of conservation of pleasure, dictating that only the precise dosage of stimuli prevents the numbing of sensory receptors. Third, trust no one, understood as the principle of absolute cognitive immunity, which forbids handing over control of one's own mental map to religions, fashions, ideologies of technical progress, or the reputational flows of fame and power. Conclusion: the expansion of perception as the only true homeland. The operational core of this existential revolution lies in an irrefutable biological axiom. What is fundamental for the human being is not the multiplication of external stimuli, but the expansion of internal perception. Industrialized consumer society makes the error of scale by accumulating objects, which inevitably leads to sensory anesthesia and the chronic consumption of painkillers to tolerate existence. The path of proportion operates in the reverse direction, transforming the individual into a taster of integral reality. Just as a taster specializing in the properties of cacao does not need to devour tons of matter to experience fullness, but requires only a minimal fraction for their sensory apparatus to identify aromatic matrices invisible to the common diner, the free man expands his receptivity toward the entirety of the empirical plane. By cleansing attention and focusing it on the molecular variables of everyday life, breathing, the weight of the air, the textures of basic food, or clean verbal exchange, the range of pleasures expands until stabilizing homeostasis in a continuous flow of basal joy that predictably leads to ecstasy. At 250 years of American independence, the somatic verdict is conclusive. The only real independence is the emancipation of the neurotic prefrontal cortex and the return to the throne of the cerebral insula, because the sovereignty of the flesh is the only temple that no empire and no machine will ever be able to supplant.